fall of '62.
For school?
To go to Chouinard. I had been accepted at Chouinard. And I had a choice between the San Francisco Art Institute and Chouinard, and I wanted to be in LA, so I picked Chouinard and got accepted, and it was great. I had made up my mind to come to LA when I was still a kid, because we came out here on vacation, and when I was 11 or 12 and went to Disneyland and Hollywood and LA, and I just thought, well, that's the place for me. This is better than Cleveland. And so it was a combination that the high school art teacher recommended Chouinard, so it was a very good school, and it was in LA, so the die was cast a long time ago. And because Disney was so involved, you got half of your education paid for by Disney. So that was really another big benefit, that for every dollar you put in, it was matched. Because it was, well, first of all, I was going to be an animator or in commercial art at any rate. And so that was one reason that it was, because then it funneled it into Disney Studios. Same reason that Cal Arts is where it is. That Uncle Walt paid the bills, and he used to come to Chouinard every once in a while. It was really interesting for growing up with him, and then being in the painting lab and having Walt Disney walking around looking at your work. So, but then I decided that wasn't what I was supposed to be doing. They make you take overall, foundation classes anyway, and then I discovered that I didn't really want to be in advertising, and started hanging out with fine art type kids, and didn't know what the hell they were doing. I remember seeing a show by Doug Wheeler, because they used to have gallery shows in the building of students, and I guess Doug was graduating or something, and this was before I knew him, and he had a show of his sculpture, and I, not being in fine art yet, I couldn't figure out what the hell that was. And later on, becoming friends with Doug, and now I'll go down to his opening for PST at San Diego. So it's kind of funny.
That's great. Yeah.
Well, you learn.
You learn from everybody.
You learn from everybody. I learned from simply, wandering over to the fine art building and looking around. That's the initial way, and thinking, well, what is this? And getting to know artists that were there at the time. But the faculty was a mixture of, kind of normal workaday types that came out of the advertising industry or from teaching drawing at Disney Studios or being employed at Disney Studios, and then people like Emerson Wolfer. So if there's anybody that you learn from, it's the model, that Emerson Wolfer was a real artist. And he treated you like one, and you learned that way, by example. You could go to the LA County and see his work and then talk to him about it. So I would say that's probably, that and the other students, and just by taking the classes, learning how to draw, and I don't know, it's just the school itself was it. It was really a great period for that school, and of course all the people that went there. So it was kind of like a microcosm of being an artist in LA, actually. Even though when I was there, Boucher, those guys weren't there, they had been there off and on. But almost anybody that you met or knew had gone there. or was involved in it in some way. Before we got out of Chouinard, instead of going to school, we started a gallery. We had a cooperative gallery called Gallery 66 on Melrose in Western, basically, which we ran for about a year. And probably the only person that you know who was involved in it was Terry Allen. So basically, it was me and Terry and a number of other, some from Chouinard, some not from Chouinard, and so we had this cooperative gallery, and that was really our substitute for the last year of school or so. I don't even remember being at school, and it wasn't necessary. One of the teachers helped set it up, Mitsumi Kanemitsu, who was an artist at the time around here. And so that begins to open you up, and then of course Art Forum was here at the time. So you begin to, kind of, think outside of LA, and then with the beginnings of conceptualism, people began to travel, and so I don't know. I mean, Kossuth was out here, and Larry Wiener was out here, and Sasigulab was out here, and there began to be connections to New York, and some of it was connected to artists that knew them from here. People started to go back and forth. I went to New York for the first time in 1970 and lived there for 3 or 4 months, and then went broke and came back to LA. But I had already met artists, so when I went to New York, then I would see Joseph or Lawrence or whoever, and of course then their experience from Europe, then that just keeps expanding. It's basically from meeting artists, and they started to come out here. And being from Cleveland, I could have gone to New York, but I wanted to come out to sunny Southern California and go to the beach, and but I still had one part of me, related to New York. In high school, I would sit there and read the New York Times in study hall or whatever. So you were, I don't know, it was always kind of halfway connected. And then, so after getting out of school I got out in 67, and the first time I went and stayed in New York was 3 years later, so it pretty quickly developed. But it's mostly from meeting people who came out here. When you went to Chouinard at that time, you either were a painter or a sculptor. That's, you had to choose between one of those two disciplines. And so coming out of Chouinard, I was basically a painter. But I had also done sculpture, did kind of painted wood sculpture a la, what was coming out of Europe at the time, particularly in London. I can't think of the artist's name now, but Philip King and those kind of people that were doing painted wood sculptures. And so it was kind of like sculpture coming off the wall, or a kind of stain painting kind of stuff. I don't know. It was that's what you come out of school, and then you have to start over again. So so then when I began to start over and decided that painting was not what I should be doing, or sculpture, then that's when I met the other people, and Eugenia Butler's gallery and all of that helped bring people out here, and you got to know the world outside of LA. But at Gallery 66, it was still the kind of painting sculptor dynamic, painted wood sculpture and some kind of stainish canvas multiple things, but I think one thing that got me started thinking outside of LA, or I don't know, just in general, was that, you know, when you come out of school, you gotta go and take your slides around and get started. And at that time, you had half a dozen galleries that you maybe thought you could go to at most, but only a couple that were really, you know, interesting. So it was Nick Wilder and then Irving Blum over there at Ferris. And so I took my slides to Nick Wilder. And in those days, you just walk in the gallery and you know, introduce yourself and say, hi, you know, I'm an artist, I just got out of school and I got some slides, you want to look at them? And then Nick at his desk, I say, yeah, sure, let's look at them, you know. And can you imagine? There's nobody else in the gallery anyway.
Right.
And so Nick took a look at the slides and he really liked them. It was the painting stuff. He said, well, yeah, I better come and look at these. So, you know, like within a day or two, he was down at the studio making phone calls, saying, oh, well, I got this stuff here, blah, blah, blah. So then I would get introduced to lots of people through Nick. I met the Grinsteins and met, you know, well, I don't know if the Grinsteins actually through Nick, but it's all at that period, you know, they're late 68 probably. No, actually it's probably 67. Probably 67, because I was in my first serious group show that Elyse Grinstein put together at the Jewish Community Center in 68. And Nauman was in it, and Mike Asher was in it, and all of the people at that time. And you know, then Ed Boucher and Irwin, and I mean, it was a mix of, you know, there was no hierarchy really. I mean, we were younger artists and they were a little bit older, but, you know. So Elyse put us all together in this group show, and it was connected to New York. They had a panel discussion. I think Olitsky was on the panel, and Irwin was on the panel. You can imagine that. And so I don't know, you got introduced quite early to something outside of LA. I don't know anybody who was just thinking about LA. I mean, LA was my subject at the time, but it wasn't my worldview. You could get things done and all of that, but you know, my generation, you knew you had to go to New York at some point. You couldn't stay around here. And then, of course, when John got out to Cal Arts and told everybody, then that's what happened then. But you know, we all knew that, and so that was just part of the program. And then the galleries started showing stuff from New York and Europe, and I don't know. And then you get included in those shows, and it just expands, and I don't know, it just keeps growing. And then you go there, and but LA was not as isolated as people think it was. I mean, everybody was looking to, you know, whatever they could find anywhere. So it isn't as local as people might think it was. Maybe when we were running Gallery 66, we were still at school. I mean, we were like 21 years old or something, and you don't know a whole hell of a lot. But it wasn't too far after that, you know, information started to come in pretty quick. I mean, starting in the mid-60s, you had all those people coming out here from New York doing performances, and Oldenburg was out here, and you know, you can research it out, and you know, people started to come out here and do things. We used to go to the cinema on Western every Friday or Saturday night at midnight and stay in there all night long looking at experimental films. This was, who knows what year it was, 66, 67. We would stand outside, and at midnight you would go in. And that's when the films were being made. I mean, that's where I saw all the Warhol films right after they were being made in the mid-60s or so. You saw everything from, you know, Bruce Conner to Taylor Mead to, you know, the whole world of experimental film was there to be seen every Saturday night. First, fresh out of the box. And that's the late 60s. So that stuff started to come in. You know, there was a lot of stuff around. Museum of Modern Art and Warhol's opening and all of that stuff. And then by, I don't know, 73, 74, whatever, it's like nothing, zero, back to square one.
Right.
So that's right. And then you had a long dry period until what, the mid-80s or something, and started to pick up again a little bit. But if you think of the late 60s, you had Eugenia Butler Gallery, you had the Dwan Gallery, you had, you know, other ones, some older, some newer, and you had the Pasadena Art Museum, and you had whatever was going on at LACMA. So, you know, there was a period there, and then all of them were gone. It's kind of amazing. And, you know, then you have your CETA projects and all these other things that kind of fill in the holes. And but I mean, people could start galleries. I mean, you know, Claire Copley, when she was out here, she didn't initially think about having a gallery. It's just that there was a lively scene of people and a kind of a history, well, with her in particular and her father and his gallery. But also, you know, kind of just involvement with Europeans, New Yorkers, and us in LA. So I, you know, it's hard to. It's just the energy that you have and lots of possibilities because it doesn't cost anything. This is the same everywhere. Gara's father lived here. Gara's father was an animator at Hanna-Barbera. And so Hare came out to, just because he was familiar with LA, because his father was here, and Bashian came too. They were friends there, and came out here to go to school, and you know, I guess the same reason we all come, because it's California, and particularly for Dutch people, I mean, it's really something. So I think that has more to do with it than, you know. You don't know anything about the cost of living at that point anyway. You're just a broke student, and it's just kind of normal. And that existed for quite a long time. It wasn't until the 80s that it started to get even a little bit more expensive. But no, you had to have a lot of your own energy, because nobody else was around to do it. And there was no market. I mean, you know all of these things. It's common knowledge. But you know, it's really a big factor. It plays a huge role when you can live so cheap, and if you want to open a gallery, fine, you know, $100 a month or something.
Or a cafe.
Or a cafe, or whatever, yeah. Right. And, you know, you also had really good collectors. I mean, generous people. They were not just in it, you know, to buy things and all of that. That it was really a part of a community, and small, but, you know, really accessible and, you know, of enormous help. I would hate to estimate the work that would never have been here had it not been for some of these people like Stanley and Elyse and others. Well, I can talk on a personal level, but I don't think that my experience is so different from everybody else's, that, you know, they're just generous people who were accessible, and if you had a project, I mean, I was very close to them anyway. I mean, I would go and have lunch with Stanley, you know, all the time. I ran a forklift business down on Alameda Street. So I would drive down to Alameda and have lunch with Stanley, and down there in South Central, and you know, we'd talk about art and the art world and everything, and so I was close to them. And then when I would have this idea to do something, and Stanley would know about it, and he would say, well, maybe, you know, I could help you do this part or that part, you know. It's not really, you even had to ask for it. And so that impacted an enormous range of people. Some you would know and some you may not. And that's just the way it was. And so then they started Gemini, and then that brought even more people in town, and so I would get to know even more people. Like when I had Al's Cafe, that's when I met Alan Capro and I met Rauschenberg. They all came, and it's hard to underestimate what a small little community with the energy what it had, and the unlimited possibilities with just a little bit of money, and a few very generous individuals, and I mean, you know, you look at their collection, it's an incredibly personal collection, and then the other kind of collectors that have a more kind of mainstream collection, there's a huge difference. Mm-hmm. And most of those pieces were given to them out of their, you know, kind of generous support of things. Yeah, I mean, I can't even name all of the artists that I met for the first time, either at their house or through them or one way or another, whether they were coming out for Gemini or even before that, you know, when everybody would wind up there for a party. But Jim Butler, you know, Jim and Eugenia had the same kind of scene. Mm-hmm. So, you know, you had at least two really wide open possibilities there of, you know, to where I met buyers, and I mean, just the list just goes on, you know, of this exchange between New York and LA that was mostly like that. Because it wasn't about having big shows or doing anything like that. It was just getting to know, you know, each other in the kind of scope of an international beginning international scene, or beginning for us anyway, beginning for us out here, because before that it really didn't exist, except for pop art to some degree with Luce and Joe Good and a few other people. But the international conceptual scene really focused, and that's what brought everybody together. You know, when you went to New York, you could go to Finelli's, or you could go to any number of art bars that Mickey Ruskin would start, and I mean, I met people in those places, you know, going to the early, you know, pre-Max's bars that he ran. And I don't know what the first one was that you might have gone to, but
University Place.
There was one where Julian Schnabel was the dishwasher. That was Remington's or something.
I forget exactly the name of it. Joseph had a kind of ongoing table.
Who did?
Christoph.
Oh, yes. No, everybody had their tables. That's right. That's right. Dennis Oppenheim had his table, and he had his you know, crew there, and then Joseph had his table. And, you know, that's right. But that's real New York. Yeah. I guess it just kind of extends out, and you know, the cafe was not made specifically for that, but it certainly encompassed that idea, and then expanded on when it became the hotel a couple of years later. But it really was important as a space where people could come to and hang out and talk, and that's why, you know, I had beer and coffee for 50 cents or whatever, you know, so that anybody could come and sit around. You didn't have to buy the dinners, or you didn't have to spend the night or whatever. You could just hang out. And it was a way of having that. The only other place was Barney's Beanery. And that was a generation a little bit before us. I mean, I got to know those guys there, but And you could always go there, and it was the only place where your types were. But it wasn't the same as going to Finelli's or some other place where any time of day or night you could walk in there and maybe your peers were in there. So we didn't have that here. LA never really had a bar culture. It was more for, I don't know, certain cultures or something. It wasn't a general kind of bar scene. So the cafe becomes a bar in a way. Whether there was anything really going on or not, or you made it up yourself, there always seemed to be plenty to do, and one thing would replace another. When Eugenia Butler's gallery closed, then a couple of years later, then Claire Copley opened hers and carried on the program. And then, you didn't have anything, and then you had Leica and Lace, and they would then disappear, and I mean, Lace is still here, but I don't know, it's one thing it always seemed to eventually turn into something else. If you look at Basjan, you look at Hervé Elk, you look at Bill Levitt, you look at myself, you look at, other people of that time and place, LA just shows up all over the work. And maybe, I always think that at least at that time, when you come from somewhere else, at least at that period in LA's life, it was a fascinating place. And maybe from people who still come here today, they think it is. I don't, but, I had my time. And so it's a natural starting place for a subject, because it's so broad and at that point accessible. And you're just fascinated with it. So coming from the Midwest or coming from Holland, or Bill comes from the Midwest too, I think it's different than people who grew up here. They don't seem to have the same initial interest in it. So, I mean, that's where the cafe comes out of, that's where all of these things come out of, the early photo books, the first pieces that were shown at Eugenia Butler's, it all comes out of exploring this Southern California aesthetic that you look at from afar. I mean, I used to work in a truck stop in Cleveland, and one day some kids from California came through with surfboards on their car, and you thought, oh my God, that's just really fabulous. So I don't know, it's an attraction that then you want to dive into. And in those days, there were so many ways to dive into it. Photography, no video at that point, but photography or film, or all of the things that we saw going on. And then you have to develop ways to show it. You have to find sympathetic people to show it. So, maybe you start off and do it yourself. And then somehow this small community gets behind it. And I think one of the main things was the LA County New Talent Award. That focused people. Because you had this group of collectors that, whatever they called themselves, were part of LA County. They would go around and come to your studio, and every year they would look and try and decide who should get this New Talent Award. And so you were, a part of that, and then you got to know them. That's how I got to know Eugenia Butler or Elyse Grinstein, and just a small group of ladies from the museum. That then generated these shows and galleries, and it was very, very lively. Galleries maybe didn't last long. Rico Mizuno didn't last very long, and Eugenie only lasted a couple of years, but like you say, that period there was really very